Hello, everybody. Today we have here Professor Joseph Trabbic of Ave Maria University to give a talk on God in Postmodernity. He got his BA in philosophy at the University of Dallas, his MA in philosophy at Fordham University, and his PhD in philosophy at Fordham University. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Joseph Trabbic.
Thank you, Harley. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. I also want to thank Harley again for organizing everything, and Ryan for getting me from point A to point B. Now, before I start, I was asking Ryan as we were driving over here, maybe someone here can give me an answer to this question. Since this is the University of Oklahoma, why do you call it OU? Does anyone know the answer to that question?
Oklahoma University.
What's that?
It was formerly called
It
Oklahoma
was.
University. If you look at some of the older documents, yes.
Oh, okay, so that must be the answer. Okay. Okay, well, the mystery is gone now. All right, so, I'm giving, the talk tonight is, I think officially, I gave the title, Is Postmodernism a Problem for Religion? But I think the paper that I have is called God and Postmodernity. It's the same thing either way. Is postmodernism a problem for religion? I think is a little more intriguing title. So I'll just get started here. I probably don't need the mic, but since we have it, I'll use it. Some Christian thinkers claim that by reason, that is, by our natural power to know, we are incapable of finding out anything about God. However, they do not deny absolutely that we can know God. Their claim is rather that it is only by a special supernatural gift that God makes himself known to us. This gift is the gift of what we call faith. Without faith, they tell us, it is impossible to know God. This view of our knowledge of God is typically called fideism. Among the better-known Christian fideists, we can count the early Christian writer Tertullian, the French Renaissance philosopher Michel de Montaigne, he was also a Catholic, and the 20th century Swiss Calvinist theologian Karl Barth. Other Christian thinkers have a different view. While they would agree with fideists that God can and does grant us knowledge of himself through the supernatural gift of faith, they would also claim that we can have some knowledge of God by reason. Let's call the Christian thinkers who take this view anti-fideists. This is probably not the best label to give them because it only defines them negatively, but I haven't come up with anything better. St. Augustine, St. Anselm, and St. Thomas Aquinas are examples of anti-fideists. The teaching of the Catholic Church is anti-fideist, and I would count myself as an anti-fideist too. You can find plenty of people who will deny God's existence. This is not, however, a new phenomenon. It has been with us for millennia and predates Christianity. Although our fideist friends might, given the chance, invite atheists to believe in Jesus Christ, they would not feel compelled to give them rational arguments for God's existence. Anti-fideists like me, on the other hand, might think in a particular case that it would be worthwhile to invite atheists not only to believe in Jesus Christ, but also to discuss with them the reasonableness of believing in God. The reasons for disbelief in God have not always been the same. In the past couple centuries, some people have supposed that the natural sciences give us grounds for denying God's existence. But this can only be true if it is assumed that the natural sciences are equipped to investigate something like God. The natural sciences study what we can perceive with our senses directly or indirectly, with or without instruments, and what we can in some way measure, that is, what has weight or velocity or volume or temperature, etc. Yet God, as Christians understand him, is not a reality along these lines. We cannot perceive him in any way with our senses or measure him. Investigating God by means of the natural sciences would be like using math to deal with a grammar problem. The method doesn't fit the object. I realize that there are many people who believe that the natural sciences offer us the only reliable knowledge of reality. This is what we call scientism. The problem with scientism is that it's not a scientifically provable view. Science cannot ask whether there is anything beyond the physical universe because it simply doesn't have the means to answer the question. It is only equipped to study the physical universe. Consequently and paradoxically, scientism is itself radically unscientific. Scientism is a powerful contemporary cultural force, but I'm not here to talk about scientism. My topic tonight is another powerful contemporary cultural force, postmodernism. The question that I want to ask is whether postmodernism is a problem for belief in God. Of course, if we are going to be able to respond to this question, we will need to have an understanding of what postmodernism is and why it might pose a challenge to belief in God. The meaning of postmodernism varies somewhat across disciplines, but the differences may not be all that great. Since I am a philosopher, I'm going to talk about philosophical postmodernism. In philosophy, postmodernity names both a historical period and a way of thinking that is supposed to be in sharp conflict with modernity. From a philosophical point of view, modernity is usually seen as beginning in the 17th century with the thought of the French philosopher René Descartes and extending into the late 19th century. Now, two caveats should immediately be registered. The first is that the relationship between modern and postmodern thought is not simply one of conflict. Certain elements in modern thought paved the way for postmodernism. Furthermore, the genealogy of these elements in modern thought can be traced back beyond modernity to the Middle Ages, at least. The second caveat is that some of the areas of conflict between postmodern and modern thought are also areas of conflict between postmodern thought and medieval and ancient thought. The lesson here is that to understand postmodern thought, it is not enough to compare it with modern thought. It must be compared with medieval and ancient thought as well. However, I'm not going to do that in this talk, at least not on any grand scale. Instead, I'm going to do something much more modest. I'm going to narrow my focus to just two central themes and two central thinkers. The themes I'm going to discuss are truth and reason, and the thinkers I'm going to discuss are St. Thomas Aquinas and Jean-François Lyotard. I will start with truth and reason. Now, God is also going to be one of the themes, but he'll make an entry a little later in the paper. Okay, so the first theme, truth. There are truths that depend on us, on what we do or think, and could, as a result of changes affected by us in our doing or thinking, fail to be true in the future. This is true, for example, with the rules of baseball, so 3 strikes counting as an out. It also is true of the fact that the President of the United States has to be at least 35, or that red traffic lights mean stop. We could at some point decide to make 4 strikes count as an out. Or we could lower the legal age to be president to 30, or we could make the green light the stoplight. Let's call these truths that depend on what we do or think, human truths or constructed truths. Constructed truths are subject to the choices we make and the agreements we have with each other. Many of us, probably most of us, believe rightly that there is another category of truths that don't depend on what we do or think, and so are true regardless of our doing or thinking. For example, that 3 plus 3 equals 6, or that nothing can both exist and not exist at the same time and in the same respect, or that change occurs. There's nothing about these truths that depends on us. Excuse me here. There's nothing we can do about them. In fact, they are of such a nature that they would be true even if we didn't exist. Let's call these sorts of truths objective truths. Objective truths don't depend on the choices we make or the agreements we have. No matter what we choose or what agreements we have, 3 plus 3 equals 6. It will go on being true. If you don't believe this, then try sometime to create a hexagon, a 6-sided figure, by drawing 3 sides and then 2 more. Or by drawing 5 sides and then 10 more. You won't get a hexagon. I believe we need to distinguish a third category of truths, which I will call undecidable truths, but I will postpone talking about them until a little later. Now, truths are supposed to be about reality. When I say I know some truth, I am claiming to know something about reality. I am claiming to have latched on to some part of reality with my mind. If there were only constructed truths, then reality itself would be entirely our construct. The whole of reality would be something we have made. It would all be like the rules of baseball. That is, it would all be subject to what we do or think. But if there are objective truths, then at least some part of reality would not depend on us at all. Some part of it would be objective and would be the way that it is, even if we didn't exist. If I held the view that reality is entirely our construct, then I would have to insist that there are no objective truths. I would have to hold, for instance, that 3 plus 3 equals 6 is just our construct, which means that I would also have to hold that because of our decisions, it could change at some point in the future, such that tomorrow or next year or next century, 3 plus 3 could equal something besides 6, say 7. But we have already seen that this is impossible, so it would be absurd to embrace universal constructivism as a theory about reality, that is, the view that everything is constructed by us. However, there is another reason to reject universal constructivism. If the whole of reality were constructed by us, then we must also have constructed ourselves, the ones who are doing the constructing. To do that, we would have had to exist before we existed so that we could put ourselves together. But evidently, nothing can exist before it exists. Again, then, we see that embracing universal constructivism leads to absurdity. Thus, we can safely conclude that not only are there constructed truths that we make, and that there is constructed reality, but that some parts of reality are objective, and so that there are objective truths too. Let's turn now to the other theme that I said we would talk about, reason. Reason has always been understood as our natural power to know. I'm going to define knowledge very simply as awareness of truth. To know that a hexagon is a 6-sided figure is just to be aware that it is the case that hexagons are 6-sided. Some knowledge is only probable. Thus, if I see dark clouds gathering in the sky, I know that it is likely to rain. However, it is also possible for the sky to clear up and for the rain never to fall. This sequence of events occurs frequently in South Florida, where I'm from. So my knowledge that it's going to rain is merely probable. For knowledge to be certain and not merely probable, I need to be aware that things must be as I take them to be and can't be otherwise. There are some philosophers who believe that no knowledge can be certain. The technical term in philosophy for this view is skepticism. Skeptics deny that our reason has the power to be certain about anything. Are the skeptics right? Is there nothing about which we can be certain? To show that the skeptics are wrong, it would not be necessary to demonstrate every single truth about which we can be certain. It would be sufficient to show that there are some truths, one or several, about which we can be certain. Whether there are other truths besides these about which we can be certain is something that we could inquire about later. Now, it seems to me that we don't need to look very far to find what we're after, nor do we need to engage in a lot of sophisticated philosophy. We can just appeal to the 3 examples of objective truths that I listed earlier. It is clear that what would contradict them must be false. Could it be true, say, that nothing is undergoing change right now? No, it is evident that my mouth is opening and closing, and at the very least that my perceptions are changing. It would be false to claim otherwise. Could it be true that 3 plus 3 equals anything besides 6? Of course not. So I believe we can set aside any worries about skepticism. I believe that given the many debates that have raised, I realize that given the many debates that have raged about skepticism in the history of philosophy, some people might think that I'm being too cavalier about it. I'm afraid that all I can say about this is that I'm not at all impressed with skepticism and believe that too many people are too ready to give it credit. This is not to say that many skeptics are not skilled philosophers or that they haven't constructed formidable arguments on a variety of topics. Against either of these claims, the Scottish philosopher David Hume would be an obvious counterexample. All I wish to say is that the central claim of skepticism, that we can't be certain about anything, is easily defeated. I don't want to give you the impression that I think that the only kind of knowledge worth having is certain knowledge. Probable knowledge is also very important. It makes sense in many cases to believe truths that, from the standpoint of reason, are only probable. We could not live very successfully unless we did. For example, to make plans, we often need to have an idea of what the weather or traffic is going to be like. And we have to go with weather predictions and beliefs about the weather that are only probable, or about the traffic. To interact well with other people, we need to have an idea about how they will respond to what we say or do. But our beliefs about them will only be based on probability and not certainty. Of course, we could go on and on describing cases that show the importance of probable knowledge in our lives, but I think you get the picture. So it would seem that we can take ourselves to establish 4 key points so far. First, that there are constructed truths. Second, that there are objective truths. Third, human reason is capable of certainty about some things. And fourth, even probable knowledge is important. Let's move on then from our themes to our thinkers. These themes will return again. The thinker I want to start with is St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas, as you may know, was a medieval theologian. He was a priest of the Order of Friars Preachers, also known as the Dominicans. According to Thomas, as I said at the beginning of the talk, we can know God both by faith and by reason. Consequently, he tells us that there are 2 kinds of theology or knowledge of God. There is, on the one hand, a theology that we can develop using reason, and Thomas calls this philosophical theology. Today we also call it natural theology. On the other hand, Thomas says that there is a theology that we can develop using reason together with faith. He calls this sacred doctrine. He understands himself to be doing this latter kind of theology, but because it incorporates reason, he also incorporates natural theology or philosophical theology in his work. And it is Thomas's natural theology that I want to discuss tonight. Thomas would agree with the 4 points I just mentioned. He would agree that there are constructed truths, that there are objective truths, that human reason is capable of certainty about some things, and that even probable knowledge is important. Thomas believes that by reason we can know with certainty that it is objectively true that God exists, and that he has certain attributes like goodness, wisdom, oneness, etc. This is what he tries to show with his famous 5 arguments for God's existence, and with the treatise on God's nature that follows them. However, he does not believe that demonstrating these truths about God is an easy matter. I just lost my place here. Or that many people will be able to follow them, or that is, follow the demonstrations. But he does think that they allow us to say with confidence not only that it is reasonable to believe in God, but also that we all should believe in God. Thus, Thomas would tell us that atheism does not have any ultimate rational justification. And that's a pretty big deal, especially when you consider how common atheism is today. For Thomas, this doesn't mean that someone couldn't have very good reasons for being an atheist. What it does mean for him is that this atheism couldn't rest on irrefutable proofs, because the irrefutable proofs tell against atheism and not in favor of it. To understand the claim Thomas is making about God, we need to understand what it means to give a proof or demonstration. It means, first, to give reasons or evidence for what we believe. In doing that, we are trying to show that what we believe is true. As I explained earlier, we know that something is true when we are aware that things must be as we take them to be. I can show in a direct or indirect way that something is true. I can show you in a direct way that it's raining by asking you to look outside. So that would be a direct proof. If I say, it's raining, and you say, how do you know? And I say, look, that's a direct proof. But there are also indirect proofs. If I show you that something is true because it is implied by other truths, things that are true, then I'm leading you to some truth, not directly, but indirectly through the other truths. Think of how a detective comes to see the truth by a series of clues that lead him to the perpetrator of the crime. Thomas's proofs or demonstrations of God's existence are of the indirect kind and arrive at God by a series of truths about the world that lead us to him. The teaching of the Catholic Church is in agreement with Thomas. According to the First Vatican Council, which took place between 1869 and 1870, quote, God, the beginning and end of all things, may be certainly known by the natural light of human reason by means of created things, end quote. The Council cites St. Paul's letter to the Romans as one of the sources of this teaching. In the first chapter of the letter to the Romans, St. Paul tells us that the pagans who do not acknowledge God are without excuse because God can be known through his creatures. Although some theologians have disagreed about what exactly the First Vatican Council intends to say about our ability to know God, Pius XII later made some clarifications in his encyclical Humani Generis in 1950. There, Pius XII teaches that one of the things that the Council intends to say on this score is that human reason is able, without the help of divine revelation or grace, to demonstrate God's existence. I would like to walk you briefly through one of Thomas's proofs for God's existence, but I will save that to the end of the talk. Before I get to it, I want to say a few words about the other thinker I promised to discuss, Jean-François Lyotard. Lyotard, who died in 1998, was a French philosopher, as you may have guessed from his name. He taught at the University of Paris 10, Nanterre, and published over 30 books. Along with people like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, Lyotard is among those philosophers most associated with postmodernism. In his book, The Postmodern Condition, he formulated what has become perhaps the most influential definition of postmodernism. According to Lyotard, postmodernism is characterized by an incredulity towards meta-narratives. On the assumption that to some of you that definition means absolutely nothing, let me try to explain in more accessible terms what I think Lyotard is getting at. Postmodernism is incredulity towards meta-narratives. The first part of this definition isn't difficult. Incredulity means unwillingness to believe. If I'm incredulous about something, say about snow falling in Miami, then I don't believe it. Lyotard tells us that in postmodernity, we don't believe meta-narratives. But what's a meta-narrative? In French, the word is méta-récit. Trying to define it literally would only get us part of Lyotard's meaning. A narrative, or récit in French, of course, is a story or an account. The prefix meta suggests comprehensiveness. A meta-narrative, then, would be a comprehensive story or account. The meta-narratives that Lyotard is talking about are meant to be comprehensive, but they are not simply stories or accounts. They are attempts to prove certain objective truths about large segments of reality or about reality as a whole. Lyotard calls these big kinds of objective truths totalizing truths. That's his term. Postmodernists are people who do not accept these proofs or the totalizing truths that they are about. It is crucial to observe that Lyotard's intention in what he says about postmodernism is not only descriptive but prescriptive. When I describe something, I'm simply telling you what it's like. When I prescribe something, I tell you how things ought to be or what you ought to do. Lyotard isn't just describing the postmodern condition, he's presenting it as how things ought to be. Lyotard holds that we shouldn't believe in meta-narratives. We should reject efforts to prove objective truths about large segments of reality or about reality as a whole. As a case of the kind of thing he is rejecting, Lyotard points to Karl Marx. Marx tries to argue that the whole of history is characterized by class struggle. This is a meta-narrative in Lyotard's sense. Presumably, Lyotard would be just as critical of Francis Fukuyama's defense of liberal democracy as the best political regime, or with the attempt in physics to produce a theory of everything. According to Lyotard, every attempt to prove some truth assumes a set of rules that specify what will count as proof. These rules can only have force, says Lyotard, if we agree to them. Without our assent, they have no power over us. Different cultural groups and disciplines have different rules about what counts as proof or about what conditions must be met if we are to accept something as true. Americans have their rules, Koreans have others, scientists have different rules from mathematicians, and Christians and Buddhists have different rules too. On this assumption about a relativism of criteria for truth, Lyotard concludes that it's foolish to think that we can demand that people accept anything as universally true or true of some significant part of reality. All we can say is that a given truth claim is accepted by one group but not by another. Nothing is simply true and merits being accepted as true by everyone. This is Lyotard's view. So the postmodern disbelief in meta-narratives is fully justified, Lyotard thinks, because every meta-narrative is and must be a fraud. The truth of the matter, he would have us see, is that there is nothing but little narratives, what he calls petite receipts. And these are told by different groups, which we can agree to go along with or not. Lyotard has given up talking about reason in the singular and prefers instead to talk about rationalities in the plural. Each group has its own rationality, which doesn't overlap with the rationalities of other groups, for there is no reason that we all have in common by which we can know big objective truths. It is unclear to me whether Lyotard thinks that reality is a construct. We have already seen that universal constructivism is false. So if that is Lyotard's position, we can dismiss it without any scruples. The other possibility would be that he believes that some or all of reality is objective, but that we just can never be certain whether what we take to be true about objective reality really is true. Because we can never be certain whether an alleged truth connects us with objective reality, the best we can do is reach what earlier I called undecidable truths. These are truths that might be true or might not, and we are unable ever to know which is the case. How pervasive is the postmodernism described by Lyotard? I don't know. I have no doubt that a significant part of the dictatorship of relativism decried by Pope Benedict XVI is a result of postmodernism. Surely it is also behind some of the many violent protests on college campuses against invited speakers, like me. that we have witnessed over the past few years. Hopefully there aren't any violent protests tonight. If I can't appeal in a disagreement to a reasoning power that we share, then violence becomes the natural method to deal with our differences. As Francisco Goya says, the sleep of reason produces monsters. Does the postmodernism that Lyotard advocates pose any problems for religion? So this is our question. More specifically, does it pose problems for Christianity? It does not seem to pose a problem for fideism, the view that reason can tell us nothing about God and that we can only know about God through faith. But fideism seems to be rejected by St. Paul, who, as we saw a moment ago, tells us that even the pagans who did not have faith knew God. It does not appear, therefore, that fideism is a position within the bounds of Christian orthodoxy. But Lyotard's postmodernism would pose a problem, if it were true, for Christians who are anti-fideists. Thus, it would pose a problem for people like St. Augustine, St. Anselm, St. Thomas, and myself, and for the Catholic Church. However, to decide the question, we need to ask whether Lyotard has gotten things right. Is he right to deny the possibility of meta-narratives? As you may have suspected, I am going to argue that Lyotard has in fact gotten things badly wrong. As I see it, Lyotard's postmodernism faces at least three devastating objections. The first and most obvious objection is that it is self-refuting. It does not seem capable of expressing itself without taking the form of the very meta-narratives that it wishes to repudiate. Lyotard appears to be arguing that it is objectively true that every narrative is a little narrative rather than a meta-narrative. By arguing that something is objectively true about a large segment of reality, arguing that something is objectively true about a large segment of reality is just what a meta-narrative is supposed to do. If Lyotard wants to reject meta-narratives, he can't create one to do it. That's being inconsistent. The second objection is that undecidable truths, is about undecidable truths. If Lyotard is claiming that all possible truths are undecidable truths, then he is evidently proposing a form of skepticism. But we have seen that skepticism is false, since there are some truths about which we can be certain. The third objection is that there are some truths whose proof does not depend on rules to which we agree. In other words, there are truths whose truth isn't subject to our choice. We have called these objective truths, and we know that there are such truths. 3 + 3 = 6, for example. Lyotard wants to tell us that all truths are subject to our choice, but this simply is not the case. I can't choose for 3 + 3 = 6 not to be true, or for 3 + 3 to equal 7. It's not something that's subject to my choice. Because these objections appear to be fatal to Lyotard's postmodernism, I believe that we can plausibly conclude that it poses no theoretical threat to Christianity. That is, postmodernism doesn't pose a theoretical threat to Christianity. That's a very important conclusion to come to. There are some Christian thinkers who are in agreement with Lyotard's views and believe that they are compatible with Christianity. But if Lyotard's view of things is wrong, as I think I have shown, then no one should agree with it. Unfortunately, postmodernism, despite its theoretical indefensibility, is still a powerful cultural force. Although it isn't a problem for Christianity at a theoretical level, it remains a major problem at the practical level. It is certainly worth reflecting on what practical strategies could be effective in dealing with it. However, I will have to leave that reflection for another time. Before I conclude, I would like, as promised, to walk you quickly through one of St. Thomas's arguments for God's existence. If Lyotard's postmodernist thesis were true, Thomas's natural theology would be a fantasy, where it is clearly a meta-narrative, since it claims that it is objectively true that God exists, and that the whole of reality, apart from him, is caused to exist by him. But we have now seen that Lyotard's postmodernist thesis is false. This means that we don't need to be anxious about whether it might undermine Thomas's natural theology. This isn't to say that we can immediately conclude that Thomas's natural theology is a path to truth. That would be a non sequitur. What we can say at the moment is that it can't be challenged by Lyotard's postmodernism, since this postmodernism, if false, can't be a challenge to anything. The argument of Thomas that I'm going to lay out is the first of the 5 arguments for God's existence that he gives in his Summa Theologiae. He calls these 5 arguments ways. He calls these 5 arguments ways to God. The first way argues to God's existence from the existence of change in the world. The Latin word that I'm translating as change is motus. English translators usually render it as motion, but it can also be rendered as change, and in any case, I think that change better captures Thomas's meaning. What Thomas wants to say is that the change that is a part of everyday experience is evidence for God. Why change should be seen as evidence for God will probably not be obvious to you, so let me try to explain Thomas's reasoning. Earlier, I gave the existence of change as an example of something about which we can be certain. If change is something about which we can be certain, and it is likewise evidence for God's existence, then we can say that God's existence is certain too. In its very basic form, Thomas's first way could be presented like this. Change always involves a relationship of dependence of the thing changed on the cause of the change. If we consider everything that changes, the whole set of things that are changed, we can ask about what it is that originally introduces change into that set. Nothing in the set could have originally introduced change because everything in the set depends on the cause that changes it. Put differently, everything in the set points beyond itself to something that causes it to change. Therefore, the whole set points beyond itself to something that originally introduces change into it, and that is thus the first cause of change. The first cause cannot itself be changed by anything, for then it would not be outside the set, but a member of it. The first cause, then, is an unchanged changer, or as it is more typically designated, an unmoved mover. Thomas says that this unmoved mover is what we mean by God, and because we can show that the unmoved mover exists, we can show that God exists. This is the bare bones of Thomas's argument. To make it more intelligible philosophically, more details would need to be added. First, we would need to say why change needs a cause. Thomas explains this with the concepts of act and potency. Second, we would need to say why everything that changes depends on a cause that is other than itself. Here again, the concepts of act and potency aid the explanation. Third, we would need to say why the unmoved mover deserves to be called God. There are a number of reasons why Thomas thinks this makes sense. One reason is that the unmoved mover, because it is the ultimate cause of change, must be what Thomas calls actus purus, or pure act. A reality that is pure act cannot be acted upon by anything else, which means that it is unchanging. Because it is unchanging, it must be outside of time, and so be eternal. As pure act, it has the power to actualize whatever can be actualized, which is just the same thing as saying that it can make exist whatever can exist. If it can do that, then it must be the creator of everything that exists apart from itself and be all-powerful or omnipotent. So we can begin to see that the unmoved mover is a reality that has the attributes that we understand God to have. It is unchanging, eternal, the creator of everything that exists apart from itself, and all-powerful or omnipotent. Of course, we understand God to have other attributes besides these, but a reality that is pure act would have these other attributes as well. Now, as I said, this was just a quick run through Thomas's argument. I wanted to not simply show that there is a problem with postmodernism and that the problem with it makes it something that can't challenge religion in a more particularly Christianity. I didn't only want to show that, but I also want to show you just briefly how we might positively argue for God's existence and therefore give at least a philosophical foundation to religion. And that is where I'm going to conclude. So thank you for your attention. I should have brought some water along.
For a round of questioning, perhaps.
What's that?
A round of questioning, perhaps.
I would be very glad to have some questions.
I did have a question.
Oh, Harley, please.
The mover argument is something that I found Plato, while I was actually finishing this complete work over the break. It was actually a very good argument. A counter argument, which perhaps could be levied by the other side, let's say, is the randomness, perhaps the randomness argument of the mover. You know, and so it's like, what exactly would be your rebuttal to the argument that it's just entropy in force?
Well, if there's change going on, if something goes from being in one way to being in another way, that's what I take, for example, entropy to be, then we're talking about the actualization of a potency, okay? If we have the actualization of a potency, that potency can't actualize itself. It needs something else to actualize it, right? And that other thing, if it's going to be the sufficient explanation for why this potency, why this change occurs, why this potency gets actualized, if it's going to be the sufficient explanation, then it can't be actualized by anything else. So it would have to be pure act in order to be the sufficient explanation for why this potency has been actualized and this change has occurred. If it's not pure act, then something else will have to move it from potency to act. Eventually we have to get to something that's pure act, right? So I don't see that objection, at least in that formulation of it, does anything to the argument in the first way.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions?
There, yes, in the back there, yes.
Okay, I'd like to preface my question with just kind of a comment here, which is that it seems rather obvious to me that the way of postmodernity lies in badness, because if you, by this sort of categorical rejection of meta narratives, is something I would almost go as far as to say like unnatural. There's something very there's something eminently human about constructing a narrative of the all. Something very human and natural to thinking about asking grand big questions. This is just like a basic fact of human nature, right?
Yeah.
And so to sort of suppress that impulse or suppress that sort of to have this kind of influential theory permeate a lot of kind of institutions that suppresses this very natural human inclination. I'm just kind of curious, like how you see, like what kind of, deleterious consequences you see in, the society around us that result maybe in significant part from this very pernicious theory.
Yeah, well, lots. I mean, the moral consequences are pretty obvious, right? So if there is nothing that's truly good for us to do or truly bad for us to do, then we can do whatever we want, right? But of course, that doesn't work because then, we would all be dead. So you have to then come to agreements with each other about what you're going to do and not do. But
it almost seems like that's the purpose of the theory, if I may. It's almost convenient to like unshackle yourself from all,
sure.
It almost seems very convenient to unshackle oneself from all tradition, all moral custom, all mores that have been transmitted and inherited. I mean,
right. But we can't, even at a practical level, we have to live even if that were true, which it's not, we couldn't live as if it were true.
Right.
We would have to live as if the opposite were true.
Right.
If I may be so bold to add a bit to that, oftentimes the attack of postmodernists, at least from what I've seen of reading Foucault's work in Civilization and Madness, is to play the victim card, to say that we are the victims of these meta-narratives, and because of these meta-narratives, we are enslaved to mindless society, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And if only we could break these meta-narratives,
Yeah.
we would be free.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a line of reasoning that counters that, but I would like to hear you elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, I think for Foucault in particular, he has very practical concerns. I don't know if he began with those practical concerns, but there are different marginalized groups. So, this is sort of mid to late 20th century France is the context, right? Europe in general. So he sees these different marginalized groups, and they're marginalized because of their way of life or whatever. And so he wants to show that there's no universal moral justification for marginalizing any group. And his point, or the way that he goes about doing this, is by way of trying to show that everything that we think is natural is in fact an historical construct, right? And so if we can show that everything is an historical construct, and there's no real justification for marginalizing any group, no matter what they do, whether they're they believe in human sacrifice or they're devil worshippers or whatever, right? There's no real justification for that. So in the end, for Foucault, and this is a theme that's late, comes later in his work, although you can see how he comes to this conclusion. Everything is really about power, right? So there's no truth that that we can find about our natures, or about the nature of reality as a whole. It's whoever can manage to dominate other people, right? By whatever means. So power became a major theme in his later work, but you can see how the conclusions from his earlier work, in which he tried to show that no social institution rests on any kind of natural foundations, that it's all historical construct, would lead to this view that, look, in the end, everything is power, and it's whoever can get what they want. It's kind of, in a way, it's Nietzschean, right? You see this sort of theme in Nietzsche, but it also goes all the way back to Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, right? That's Thrasymachus' view, right? Justice is the advantage of the stronger.
But even go so far as to say Thucydides actually argues.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that's true. So what Foucault is arguing at the end of his life is really something pretty old-fashioned.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes all the way back to the pre-Socratics, right? But some old-fashioned things aren't very good, and I would say that's not one of those good old-fashioned things.
Yeah. So I guess naturally, is there any
Other questions? Yes.
This was more about just the title when you said that, is it a problem for religion?
Yeah.
And then in your talk you said it's not a problem theoretically, but it is practically.
Yeah.
Could you say more what you mean by the word problem? I was trying to just
Yeah. So just because we can show that something isn't true doesn't mean that people will stop believing it and acting as if it were true, right? So I can. I can give you the philosophical reasons why postmodernism, at least the way that someone like Lyotard or Foucault would understand it, why it's false. But some people, that doesn't mean that you're going to accept those reasons, right? We know that they're all. Even with ourselves, we can recognize something as being true or something being false, and yet our inclination, certain habits we have or whatever, prevent us from recognizing that and living in accord with it. So that's what I mean by saying, yes, we can refute postmodernism at a theoretical level, but that doesn't mean that it's not still a practical problem. So the question is then, how do you deal with it? Well, I think one of the things is to keep making the theoretical arguments, because you even though if you think of what Aristotle says in Nicomachean Ethics, unless someone already is well disposed, you can't argue them into becoming virtuous. But I think we still need to make the arguments, because they will appeal to some people, and eventually people will see the light or see reason. But then we also need to find certain practical strategies to deal with that with postmodernism. And I don't have any prescriptions for those right now. I would except to say I think it begins like any practical change does in the family with raising good families. Yes.
I'm just thinking a little bit about Chesterton's orthodoxy when he
Mm-hmm.
talks about reason specifically, like in his chapter on the maniac,
Mm-hmm.
and he pretty much says that like the mathematicians, the really reasonable ones, the ones that actually go mad,
Mm-hmm.
and they're mentally exhausted because they're trying to reason everything out. So
Uh-huh.
I guess I know Chesterton was a big Aquinas fan.
Yeah.
But I guess
Yeah.
I'm wondering where someone like Leotard would fit into that kind of mentality of, like, would he kind of...
He was being
see
too
reason-
reasonable, and that's why.
almost like he would kind of see reason, like the 3 + 3, like, let's stop trying to prove that
Yeah,
constantly,
yeah.
because we're just going to exhaust ourselves. Like, do you
Yeah.
think he would
Well-
almost line up with something like that, or...
Perhaps, yeah. To appeal to Aristotle again, Aristotle says that for some people think that a proof needs to be given for everything, in the sense of some kind of worked out demonstration. And he says that's just not true. Certain things are evident, and we can't work out a demonstration for them in the way that we work out a demonstration, say, for God's existence. So we have to find other ways to get people to see that things are true, right? So, yeah, I think one of the problems with modernity is that, or some modern philosophers, is that they believe that everything needs to be proved in this sort of rigorous way, and you can't take anything just as being evident. And I think that's a serious problem, because, again, I want to say that certain things are evident. They can't be proved. You just see them, right? It's evident that there is change. That's nothing that I need to give you, like, well, if I had a board here, give you some kind of, like, proof that there's change. No, look around you. That's the proof, right? So I think we need to see that some truths are just evident and don't need these big proofs, and others, like, say, God's existence, well, those kinds of things we can develop more rigorous proofs for. And it could be that Leotard thinks he's the person, like Aristotle says, who thinks that if you're going to claim that something is true, you need to give me some kind of developed argument for it. But I don't think I think that's the wrong way. I think that's just wrong, right? I think he would be wrong about that. And yes, doing that, I think you would go mad if you thought that everything needed to be proved in that way, right? Harley.
And too, it's like, it's because you can't, right? I mean, like David Hume, you mentioned earlier, brings up this argument, like, how do you exactly derive an ought from an is?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's nothing you can just set down and take a pencil to paper and prove along those, perhaps by formal axioms.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that really has to be unique to the human experience. But on the nature of the power dynamic argument, which follows so naturally from breaking down everything into relativism, it's like the opinion of these individuals masks that everything relates in these power dynamics. And so, how exactly would you phrase a rebuttal against that directly?
Mm-hmm. Well, you would I think you can, for one thing, you can show that, as I was doing at the beginning of the paper, that or draw people's attention to the fact that certain things just are the case, no matter whether we want them to be so or not, right? They're not a matter of power. They're just a matter of, should I say it, truth, right? I can't, it's not because I'm more powerful than other people, or someone at some point in history is more powerful than other people, that we recognize that 3 + 3 = 6. That's not something we can will away or change by the effort of our wills. So one first thing to do would be to get people to draw their attention to the fact that there are certain truths that are not subject to our choice, right? Yes, there are a lot that we could say that are truths by convention, or what I call constructed truths, yes. But not everything is like that, right? So try to make a hexagon with 5 sides. Try to make a 6-sided figure with 5 sides. Can't be done. Why not? Because a 5-sided figure is not a 6-sided figure. No matter what you do, it will never be the case. It will never be the case that the part is greater than the whole, right? It just cannot be. That's not because people have chosen that. That's just something that when you see it, you see, oh yeah, that's true. It can't be any other way. So that's one step in that direction. But of course, we human beings can be obstinate, and even if we recognize something as true, we won't admit it, and we'll keep arguing the contrary, right?
Yeah, and there's certain things that the looking at the world through the lens of power dynamics doesn't account for. It's like, why would you stroll for a walk in the park with a friend if it's all just power dynamics?
Yeah,
it's like
sure, yeah.
So
So that would be another way. So there are parts of our common experience that power dynamics could not explain, right? So if everything is about power, then explain this.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes or so left for questioning. If anybody else has any questions, other questions?
So I did kind of interrupt you earlier after I asked my question, but I'm just wondering, so you're walking around, college campus, or, reading the news.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see postmodernity, where do you see the deleterious effects of postmodernity, throughout the course of regular life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think the transgender movement is an obvious example that has certain antecedents. If you look back at a theoretical and practical level, theoretically, people like Judith Butler, who were writing about gender and its fluidity, back 20, 30 years ago, are precursors to this transgender movement. It seems to have just exploded though recently.
Gender's a meta-narrative.
Yeah, right. So there is no human nature that is, let's say, structured in a certain way as male or female. We make it. We create it, right? It's our creation, yeah. So there's no way that things ought to be. There is no nature. Now, the roots of this problem go way back, I would say, and we can, even go back to the pre-Socratics, but more proximately, you can see in the nominalism of the late Middle Ages, the beginning of the destruction of nature, and it's just continued, through modernity into post-modernity, right? We don't believe in nature anymore. And when Leotard says that, contemporary people don't believe in meta-narratives, well, nature is one of those meta-narratives. It is the meta-narrative, right? That there is a human nature, that there is a nature to reality as a whole, and so on. We don't accept that anymore. We think that we can construct everything. And your views are just your construction. My views are my construction. It's all us.
All right. That seems to be time up for the round of questioning. thank you so much for
Thank you, Harley. Thank you very much.
for speaking on this matter. And
Sure.
if you all wouldn't mind, like I was hoping for a group picture centered around the podium.
Why not?
Yeah.
With these screens on here.
Yeah, that's fine.